you might want to think about that little framework, the literacy engagement framework that I showed you earlier on, because the points or the categories of that framework are all illustrated in these examples. And up in the top of the example, I've given some example or given some connections to that framework in terms of what's happening in the example. So the first one I'll show you is a mathematics teaching unit. This is a grade 5 class. It's in a school that has more than 80% of the students from non-English speaking backgrounds. So it's a highly multilingual class. And the teacher wanted to make his data management unit more interesting. And when he taught this in previous years, he had just used the textbook and used kind of neutral content. And at this time, he decided to do something different. And he had students carry out a survey in the school of the languages that students spoke. So the students brainstormed, these were 11-year-old students, they brainstormed about what they would like to know about the linguistic composition or reality of their school. And so they generated just 3 simple questions. Then Tobin, the teacher, divided them up into groups, and each group took a different grade level and administered their little mini questionnaire to the students. With younger students who were not writing yet, the teacher helped gather the data. Then they brought all that data they gathered about the languages of the students in the school back, and they put it into spreadsheet programs, and they churned out graphs like this one in terms of the languages that were spoken and the percentages of students in the school who spoke these graphs or these languages. They generated bar graphs, pie charts, etc. So this didn't involve translanguaging in the sense of students using another language, but they were in a project where they were generating new knowledge. It was an identity project because they were finding out about who we are as a school community. The multilingual nature of the school was being presented in a very positive way. Look how multilingual we are. Tobin, the teacher, talked about how he wasn't able to get students to go out for recess, go out and play in the yard because they were so glued to the computers in the classroom, churning out these graphs, manipulating the data, seeing what they could do with it. So when we talk about connecting to students' lives, this can be incredibly powerful as a way of increasing engagement and affirming identity. Another example, and this one involved a dual language book. This was a student who'd come from Israel. His name is Tomer. And he was so grade 6s, 12-year-olds. And the teacher encouraged her newcomer students to use their first language to write, because if we had given, or if she had given Tomer a task to write a story in English, at the level that his English was, you might just get a few lines out of him. But she encouraged him to write in Hebrew initially, and then there was a teacher in the school who spoke enough Hebrew to help him translate it into English. That may not be the case in a lot of schools, but there may be community volunteers that could be used, or some Canadian schools use high school students or university students who volunteer. The high school students in Canada have to do 40 hours of community work before they graduate, and a number of them will help out as an assistant in elementary or primary schools and help with language work like this. So there's all kinds of ways in which we can do this. Obviously, Google Translate is getting better and better. That can certainly give us a rough translation of what the student has written, and then we can organize it into appropriate Swedish or English. But here's what Tomer said about this. Here were his reflections on it. He says, I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. Okay, like beginning as a baby is the identity position that he would be put into when the school is an English-only zone and when students are being reprimanded if they use their first language. He says you don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too, and then it's easier to understand the second language. Like what he's saying here is a much more comprehensible version of what I've been saying for the last half hour, namely that the two languages connect. If you've got a concept in your first language, you don't have to relearn that concept all over again. You can translate it, you can apply it from your language to the new language, and that makes it easier to understand the second language. So for a 12-year-old child, this he's incredibly insightful. I'd say that because he agrees with me, but it's. He goes on to say, the first time I couldn't understand what his teacher, Lisa, was saying, except the word Hebrew, but I think it's very smart that she said for us to do it in our language, because we can't just sit in our hands doing nothing. And you look at how many students, newcomer students in countries around the world, sit on their hands doing nothing. And not because the teacher is unkind or is not committed, but the teacher may not have the skills or knowledge to help those students. So that's one example. It's if you had given Tomer the story that he wrote, the English story that he wrote in English, if you'd given that to him before he'd written the story, he would not have been able to read it. After he had written the story, he could read it fluently. He'd learned all of those words. And so he learned an enormous amount of language by doing this. He saw himself, his identity changed, and it wasn't just this project, but other projects. He saw himself as smart. He saw himself as being able to write things that other students were interested in, that he got positive feedback. People like myself from the university were very interested in it. We put it up on websites. So, and he could email his friends back in Israel and say, check out this website, my story is up there. And they could read it because it was in Hebrew as well as in English. So it's powerful work. This is one of the first things, to my knowledge, this is the first project in the Canadian context that really put translanguaging into practice. As I said, it's called the Dual Language Showcase, and it was the idea of a grade 1 teacher, so teaching 6-year-olds, and as I said, this was a school with 80% of more than 80% of the students from non-English speaking backgrounds, and she had read about dual language books in, say, Urdu in English and other languages in English being used in the UK context, and publishers were publishing these books for children. And she tried to get some of those books in Canada at the time and couldn't find any in any significant numbers. And so she thought, well, let's maybe do it ourselves. And so she had students choose, they could either write in their first language initially, or more typically with the younger children, they wrote in English initially, and then worked with either their parents or a teacher who might speak their language, or older students to come up with a first language version of it. And there's, at this point, I think about more than 120 stories in here. There's more than 30 different languages. And these books that students produced, they were all printed out. Students got a copy. Another copy was put into the school library. So the students saw their books that they had written in the school library, along with all of the other books that they would read. I'll give you just one example of it, just to show what students are capable of coming up with. This is a story in Arabic called The Butterfly and the Flower. And I'm not sure what grade level the student was in, but possibly about grade 2 or grade 3. In some cases, the parents had keyboards or typewriters for their own language. In other cases, they didn't. In this case, they didn't. So the Arabic is handwritten, and possibly handwritten by the child's parent, which is fine. So this is how this goes. The first thing you notice here is that this child is a talented artist. Like these illustrations are just bouncing with life. And so that's something that the teacher may not have realized if, without a project like this. So it goes like this. I see a small butterfly. It has beautiful colors. It flies from flower to flower. The butterfly stands on the yellow flower. The flower says, "Welcome, butterfly. Before you came, the bee came to me and took nectar from me. How about you? What do you want?" Maybe some paranoia there. The butterfly says to the flower, "I don't want anything from you. I just want to play with you." The flower answers, "What will we play together?" "We can play in the swing," says the butterfly. The flower is so happy. Let's play, she says to the butterfly. The butterfly gives the flower a push. The flower says to the butterfly, this game is nice. The butterfly answers, but friendship is nicer. Like, and you may take a look at the sun up there, the sun wearing sunglasses. You know, there's an enormous amount of charm in this. Like what this is doing, the term that colleagues of mine and I use to talk about this kind of work is identity texts. And we're talking about text in a broad sense. It could be artwork that students do, it could be drama that they videotape and record, it could be older kids, it could be a web page that they put together. But the idea is that the students create something, they create an artifact. And once it's out there, once it's published and made available to others, they get very positive feedback on this, and it holds a mirror up to them in which their identities are reflected back in a positive light. And so when you look at students from marginalized communities who often don't get positive affirmation in the broader society, they see newspaper headlines out there about anti-immigrant sentiment, and that can make them feel like their identities are being devalued. In a lot of schools, there's no acknowledgement of that students are not just students who don't speak Swedish very well, they're multilingual students. So this is an identity project. It's also literacy engagement. It's showcasing aspects of the student that are not readily visible in the normal curriculum. Another example with a grade 7 student. This was back in 2008 when Obama was running for president for the first time. The teacher had students carry out projects where they looked at their own kind of ethnic press and articles in the in newspapers or websites focusing on the American election. And this student, I think the language is Arabic, he looked at newspaper articles from in Arabic on the election, and there was speculation as to whether Obama would be more successful than previous American presidents in helping solve the Middle East crisis, but he brought this back, and other students brought the work that they had done back into the classroom and shared it with others. So he did the research in Arabic, he wrote it up in English, and then it was discussed with other students in the class. So again, the first language is being used as a resource. It's generating new perspectives, new knowledge for all students in the class, and it's affirming students' identities. Another example from Arabic, grade 4 class. This was an English as a second language class. The teacher had students from several different language backgrounds in his class. And one of the projects he asked them to do is to look at how your language, your home language, is different and similar to English. And so here's what the Arabic group came up with. And in thinking about how they did this, they probably brainstormed what they knew themselves. They may have gone home and asked their parents about characteristics of Arabic and similarities and differences to English that the parents knew. They probably did some internet research on these issues, but they came up with this list. And first one is obvious, English starts from left to right, Arabic starts from right to left. But if you look at number 3 there, in terms of developing language awareness, in Arabic, respect is shown linguistically, it has to be expressed linguistically. So if we're talking to our parents, we can't just answer yes, we have to use honorific terms that show respect. In English, you don't do that. So this kind of project, again, is deepening students' knowledge of English. It's deepening their knowledge of their first language. It's helping them understand how language operates. And again, they're showcasing their knowledge of their language in the classroom. So they're not just in a passive role, they're generating new knowledge in terms of, both for themselves, possibly their parents, and for the teacher. The teacher is learning this stuff too, and for their peers. I'm going to just leave this, I'll talk about this just very briefly in the interest of time, but when we look at students who are failing academically or underachieving in a number of contexts, and I'm leaving out of here students who have special needs. There's 3 groups of students that tend to underachieve in a lot of countries. Students coming from linguistically diverse backgrounds, students whose home language is different from the language of the school. And the challenge for them is to learn the language as quickly as possible so that they can understand instruction in that language and catch up academically. Another group, as I mentioned before, are students from socially disadvantaged backgrounds or low socioeconomic status. And in different countries, the gap between rich and poor is, it varies. In the United States, it's huge. It's less so in most Scandinavian countries. So something like access to healthcare or nutrition is less likely to be an issue in Sweden than it would be in the United States. But one of the things that does characterize Sweden is, as well as the United States, is housing segregation amongst families from lower socioeconomic background. And there's not much students or schools can do about that, at least in the immediate future. But if we look at some of the other causal factors operating with students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, one of the major things is inadequate access to print in home and often, at least in the United States context, in school. Kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds are typically starting off school, when they start to learn how to read in school, they're 5 years behind their middle class peers. Because probably most of us in this room have, when we've had our own kids, when they were toddlers, from the time they're crawling around, we're reading stories to them, we're talking to them a lot. We buy them stories for birthday presents and other occasions. And so we're socializing our kids into literacy as a positive experience, and books as something positive. The data, and most of this research has been done in the United States, but I think it's probably very credible in other contexts too. The data from students who are growing up in a much more impoverished environment is that they don't get this kind of access to books. Parents may not be highly educated themselves. They don't have money to go out and buy books. They don't have money to buy iPads. They don't have money to take their kids to museums and other cultural experiences. And so what that means, if we look at the data from the OECD as well as lots of other sources, that this is a major causal factor underlying low achievement. It means that in schools, starting off at the preschool level, we need to saturate students with literacy. We need to maximize their access to print because they're trying to catch up with students who've had 5 years head start on them in this. And again, I think all teachers know that, okay, access to books is important. We encourage kids to read, but not too many teachers are aware of just how crucial a variable this is. And it continues to be crucial as we go up the grade levels. And then also we need to reinforce academic language across the curriculum. Students from marginalized status, we're talking here about students whose communities have experienced discrimination and are currently experiencing discrimination and exclusion in the society. If we look at Indigenous students, for example, the Sami in Scandinavian countries, First Nations in Canada, the Aboriginal students in Australia, we have a history of widespread discrimination, ranging from the incredibly brutal in countries like Canada and Australia to maybe just the more milder exclusion in some other countries. But what operates here in schools is a set of low teacher expectations. Teachers don't expect students to do as well. They may be well-intentioned, but they may also have some of the same kind of prejudices that operate in the wider society. And you've got a climate in the schools often where there's a devaluation of the identities of the students and communities. And this may get expressed in either explicit policies in the school or implicit policies that students should leave their languages at the schoolhouse door. Or it might be a kind of a benign neglect type of policy where we value students' multilingualism, but we don't do anything about it. We don't see how we can use their languages in the classroom. So there's no, when you walk around the school, there's no exposure, there's no seeing any language other than English or Swedish, as the case may be. And so that leads to a situation where students themselves may not value their language. They may see that as part of the problem, especially if they're in a Swedish as a second language class that highlights the fact that their identity in this school is of somebody who doesn't speak Swedish very well or English very well. So what do we do about it? Well, we need to connect instruction to students' lives. We need to link up what students are bringing into the classroom with what we're trying to teach them. If we're talking about Indigenous students or students who've been in a colonial type relationship, we need to decolonize curriculum and instruction, and we need to affirm students' identities in association with literacy engagement. So the major problem comes when we have all of these three categories in the same student, where we have students who are learning the school language, who are coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and whose communities have experienced or are experiencing discrimination in the society. That's when you get the major problem. You don't get a problem typically with, let's say, a family coming from Romania, both of whose parents are engineers, they're professionals, they're not low socioeconomic status, they're highly educated. The challenge for that student is to pick up the school language, but they're not dealing with the other issues. And when we look at the students from marginalized status, a lot of the research that's been done here is sociological research or anthropological research, but there's also hard data, laboratory psychological research under the heading of stereotype threat. And this research was started by a psychologist in the States called Claude Steele. And what he demonstrated was that when stereotypes about a group are communicated to individuals in that group, that dramatically affects their task performance, whether we're talking about school or other situations. Just to give you one example of how this operates. One of the studies that he did was with women from Asian backgrounds. And to one group of people, and these would typically have been university students, he said, like, the reason that we're doing this study is that we know that women don't do as well in mathematics as men. We're trying to figure out why that is, why there's this big gender gap in terms of mathematics. And so they gave them the tasks, and because they had communicated a negative stereotype about women in general in terms of mathematics, students' performance was not that great. With another group of students, they explained the purpose of the study is that we're wondering why it is that Asians seem to be so much more competent at mathematics than European background people. There's got to be something going on there, and we're looking to see how this works. They communicated a positive stereotype, and performance was much bigger. There was a huge difference between the two groups. And so when students are getting messages, either inadvertent messages or explicit messages about how smart the teacher thinks they might be, what the teacher's expectations are, that dramatically affects whether students are going to engage or withdraw. So let me show you some examples of what can be done here in terms of how these understandings can operate in schools and classrooms. So this is just what I've done. Okay, I've talked about this. So if we look at students from low socioeconomic status, and this applies to all students, and look at the importance of literacy engagement and maximizing students' opportunities to get engaged with literacy. This is in a school not too far from where I live in Toronto, where it's a big immigrant reception area. There are quite a few high-rise buildings around, and the school is more than 90% students from non-English speaking backgrounds. A lot of them from South Asian backgrounds, but not only that. One of the things that they do is that they keep the school library open 4 days a week between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock. So from Monday to Thursday, the school library stays open so that when parents, typically the mother comes to pick up their children from school, they can go into the library, they can spend time there, they can check out books to bring home from the school library. The library has a collection of multilingual books that parents and children can read. The librarian in the school library will make sure that the parent knows about public libraries and that they have a public library card. And this is exactly the kind of strategy that the research implies. And yet not too many schools do this. So they get some extra money because they're in a high needs or an inner city school, and this is one way in which they use that extra money. Walking around that same school, I came outside one of the classrooms, I think it was a grade 5 class, so about 11-year-olds, notices that students had put up, starting with the sentence starter, "Reading makes me powerful because." And so what the teacher was doing here, obviously, was initiating discussion in the class about why do we read? Why do we spend time reading? What good is it? And so students brainstormed about this, and then they came up with their own insights. So this one said, "Reading makes me powerful because I get smarter and I learn more facts. I learn new words and I will never forget." So if a student feels that way about reading, guess what? They're going to want to read. If reading is making me more powerful, if reading is making me smarter, that's something I want. Reading makes me powerful because I learn new words and I love reading. Here's Tasneem. It was too long to really fit on a photograph, but she says, reading makes me powerful because when I grow up, I can find a better job than people who can't read. Someone can also trick you to do something that will get you in trouble. What she means here is if your reading skills are low, if you don't have strong reading skills, you're not going to read the small print and you can get tricked or exploited. She says, reading gives you new words to learn. It gives my brain new ideas. It helps your vocabulary, so when you need to write something, you can use longer and harder words. In school, you can get a better mark using more words. I suspect that probably at this point, Tasneem is a chief executive officer of some big multinational corporation someplace, because she's got it all worked out. But everything she says here is supported by research. Everything. And yet, we don't do this kind of activity with students often in class. And it's especially important for students who are catching up and who may not have had extensive exposure to reading in their own homes. So if we look at students from socially marginalized communities, this is just saying again what was in the bigger diagram, but there's a quotation here from a very eminent African-American educator in the States, Gloria Ladson-Billings. She says, the problem that African-American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society. So if identity devaluation is a causal factor, a major causal factor in students not engaging, not doing well, then we've got to brainstorm about how we can teach our curriculum in ways that will affirm students' identities, because that's when they'll want to engage. Again, a few simple examples from schools around the Toronto area. The Toronto District School Board will give multilingual signs like this to any school that requests them. So students can request up to 10 languages on the sign. So when the student comes into the school, when the parent comes in on a daily basis to pick up their kids, they're seeing their languages reflected positively. This is saying very clearly to parents that we see our school as a multilingual space, not an English-only zone. It doesn't cost virtually anything, and yet it's a powerful symbolic message. This example is like it was done in the same teacher that did the other dual language books. It was done in a different year. This is a book in Urdu and in English. And it was written by 3 students from Pakistan. They were 13 years old. And Sulmana and Kanta had been in Canada for about 3.5 years. And their English was pretty fluent. Mediha had just arrived about 6 weeks before they started this project. And her English was minimal. Now, as I said before, in a typical class where you have a newcomer student and we have a writing project, you might get a few sentences full of inaccuracies that the student has written. And that doesn't make the student herself or himself feel very good. But in this case, the student, Mediha, who's a newcomer, becomes the author of a 20-page dual language book, bilingual book, written in Urdu and English, of which she is a major contributor. So what they did was, this was a social studies unit. They had been doing work on immigration, and this was a culminating project at the end of the unit. This is something that typically happens in Canadian schools. So it's a final project that the students did. So they suggested to the teachers that they work together because they were friends, and the unit was on immigration, so why not tell the story of our own immigration? So they invented a composite character called Sonia, and they discussed initially in Urdu what the story was going to be about. They got the general storyline of it, and they talked about what was going to be on each page in terms of illustrations, in terms of texts. So they did all the planning in Urdu. Mediha was a full participant in that. Then they wrote the first draft in English, and then they discussed that first draft with the teacher who gave them feedback. And then when they finalized the English version, they went back from that to Urdu. And when you look at the videotapes that we've got of students doing this, you see a lot of what linguists call meta-linguistic talk about language. You know, how do you say this word in Urdu? No, that's not the right word. It's another word. And so this talk about language was going on between the 3 students. And Mediha, whose Urdu was probably the strongest because she was the most recent arrival, she was a major contributor in that. And the other two students realized that they'd forgotten quite a few words. And so you hear students saying, Silmana in particular, who's doing most of the writing, I've forgotten what that word is. I'll have to go home and ask my mum. And so like here's what, just one of the pages from the book, but they presented with their teacher at a conference in Toronto. It was a Teachers of English as a Second Language conference. And I'll show you a little clip of Kanta talking about what this experience meant to all three of them, and her in particular.
I'm introducing Kanta, who's going to tell us a little bit about herself.
Hi, my name is Kanta. I'm from Pakistan. My first language was Punjabi, my second language was Urdu, and my third language was English. I came here in grade 4, and now I am in grade 9.
How did you feel writing the book in 2 languages, and how did you see it helping you or the others?
It helped me a lot, and using 2 languages helped us a lot to understand English better. And for Madiha, who was actually new here, and then like in Urdu, if you would write, you would say 3 words. In English, you would actually have to write 5 words. So then, if you're thinking Urdu, you would be only writing those 3 words, and then so those sentence structures didn't really make sense. But while we were doing it, it made a lot of sense to her. And then how it helped me, like it helped me that when I was here and when I came here in grade 4, like the teachers didn't know what I was capable. I was given a pack of crayons and a coloring book and to get on coloring with it. And then after, I felt like so bad about that. I am capable of doing much more than just doing that. Like I have my own inner skills to show the world than just coloring. And then I felt like those skills of me were important also. So when we started writing this book, I could actually show the world that I am something instead of just coloring. And then, so that's how it helped me, and then it made me so proud of myself that I am actually capable of doing something, and here today I am doing something like that, that I can actually show the world that I'm just not a coloring person. I can actually show you that I am something.
I think when you listen to that and contrast it with the fact that you almost never see the word identity in school policy documents, it's quite a contrast, because identity is fundamental to everything that's happening in schools. We're not, as teachers, we're not just transmitting the curriculum, we're not just hoping that our children will learn it, we're also in a process of negotiating identities. And so when students are enabled to do this kind of work that showcases their intellectual capabilities, that showcases their multilingual skills and talents in a positive way, that showcases their creativity, you're dramatically changing the ecology, the identity ecology of the classroom. So let's see. So just to wrap up and kind of summarize, I would see a lot of these issues as something that teachers in the school discuss. So rather than just seeing our role as just transmitting the curriculum comes from the politicians. They've said, this is what we need to learn. And that curriculum typically is written with a generic Swedish student in mind, which is not the student who's in a lot of classrooms. And so we can't just teach that curriculum in a one-size-fits-all way. So we need to talk about it. We need to talk about how we can meet the aims of the curriculum in ways that will engage students and also respond to what we know about what are the causal factors underlying underachievement by quite a number of students. And so just like the literacy engagement little framework, which I'd see as a way of focusing us on brainstorming about to what extent are we actually maximizing students' literacy engagement? What else could we be doing in the school context? I would see these categories here as something that we can talk about. Because the reality is that there isn't any magic formula. There's no textbook, there's no set of magical instructional routines or strategies on the shelf that you can apply that's going to fit every classroom. We've got to use our imaginations as teachers. And so the kinds of things that we can look at in looking at our own instruction in our own classroom or in our own school is, what's the image of the child that we're sketching in our instruction? So are students getting the message from the way we're teaching them that they're capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate. They may be getting the message that they're capable of becoming bilingual and biliterate in Swedish and English, but if that doesn't include Arabic, which is their first language, what are we actually saying? If the message that students are getting is leave your home language at the schoolhouse door, it doesn't really belong here, we're not giving them that message. Are they getting the message that they're capable of higher order thinking and intellectual accomplishments? In the examples that I've shown you, that message is certainly coming across. Capable of creative and imaginative thinking, capable of creating literature and art, capable of generating new knowledge, capable of thinking about and finding solutions to social issues. All of those things are illustrated in these few little examples. And so when we look at these questions, if we're not answering affirmatively to these questions, then we've got to ask, well, what can we do about it? And we can look at what's happening elsewhere. We can look at what other schools have done, either in Sweden or in the international area. We can look at resources that might be out there that will help us to scaffold the curriculum, help us get content across to students. But the solutions are ones that we in a school will discover. And one of the major things that is powerful for educators is to realize that we have choices, okay? We make a choice in terms of what messages we communicate to students about their home languages. We make a choice about what kinds of projects we get students to do. We make a choice about to what extent do we actively try to communicate a positive message about students' home languages. All of these things, those choices will be enhanced when we talk about them as a group in the school. So I'm just going to go over the summary, but there's a fundamental principle operating here. And that's that if you want students to emerge from schooling after 12 years as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented, then treat them as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented from the first day they arrive in school. And when we do that, students will respond in the ways that we communicate to them. If they see themselves in a positive light, they will act in that way. And so the transformation of identity that we've seen in the projects that colleagues of mine and I've done in these projects is phenomenal. And it's not just a transformation of student identity, it's a transformation of teacher identity. And so teachers, when they realize that their instruction is working, when they see their students doing powerful things intellectually, they feel much better about their role as a teacher. It's affirmation of their identities. And so I'll stop there, and I think we have maybe a few minutes for questions. And I wish you well in all of you who are in the classroom or who are making policies in talking about these issues and deciding what directions make sense in your own context. So thank you for being here. Thank you.